Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to our session on intersectionality. Our first paper, Pompoms and Struggle Songs, the limited space for feminism in #Feminist4. And our presenter is Chelsey Wilken from Rhodes.
Hi everyone, I just want to get myself set up. As means of an introduction, I'm a master's student in the English department, and my research is looking at the way in which literature is able to represent political theory, or rather identify the political relevance and the influence literature has. So this is what I'll be trying to do today by looking at South African poet Colloquium and creating a dialogue between her work, current protest culture, and a new way of understanding collective blackness as put forward by an African American theorist, Michelle Wright. So, in her poem on Black Solidarity in section 9, Colloquium outlines the terms and conditions of a woman's participation in Black solidarity. I've put them up on the screen for you all to see. It's things such as no feminism, limited feminism, no feminism that exposes the patriarchy, no feminism that disrupts the patriarchy, only feminism that will show up with pompoms and struggle songs, and silence, and yes, she's referring to don't bring your politics, don't bring women's politics into this. I use these terms and conditions as points of departure into analysing the limited and selected space for feminism found in these small protests of 2015 and 2016. The poem speaks to Patuma's experiences as a black queer woman taking part in contemporary protest culture and the frustration she has in being unable to articulate herself across multiple struggles because the dominant discourse of this solidarity is heteronormative and masculine in nature. The solidarity found in the Feminist movement was sparked by a return to our legacy of struggle against apartheid and in the philosophy of black consciousness as it was articulated by Steve Biko and other struggle heroes. What the solidarity neglects to take into account was that at the time of black consciousness's articulation in the 1960s, women held little place in society, whether they were white or black, and it neglected that their experiences of oppression operate at an intersection which is linked to their gender and sexual orientation, as well as to their race and to their class. I believe that black solidarity is about feminism, and feminism does have a space. Feminism as a lens would allow for the articulation of a solidarity that would accurately represent Feminist multifaceted support base and take the intersecting oppressions experienced by students on university campuses seriously. So the work of feminism is to dismantle patriarchy, and in this sense, within the patriarchy, women are positioned as docile and as objects, and feminism works to liberate women from these positions in order to bring about equality. Therefore, it should be a pillar of looking at a completely decolonized form of higher education in terms of space, place, and curriculum. And I believe Rhodes University's references protests are an example of how the interconnectedness and the intersectionality of race, gender, class, and sexual orientation can be taken up from the get-go in contemporary protest culture. Black radical feminism explicitly states that one form of oppression cannot be isolated from another. Theorist Bell Hooks argues that it encourages all of us to courageously examine our lives from the standpoints of gender, race, and class, so that we can accurately understand our position within the imperialist, white, supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. So, by foregrounding intersectionality as pertinent to decolonization in its mission statement, the movement held the potential to open up a space for the exploration and expression of the complexities of what it means to be black in contemporary South Africa. Intersectionality requires the politics of those in the contemporary moment who perceive of and perform themselves as black to be taken up by the movement with as much vigor as the call for free decolonized tertiary education. In section 8 of the poem, Patima writes that you, which in this context most likely refers to a black male, endorse intersectionality, but not at the expense of your praise and your visibility. There was a clear shift in who dominated and who was excluded from public and private spaces within Feminism 4. Visible female leaders that initially led and drove the movement and engaged with it at its onset were pushed out of conversations. Feminism was perceived as a threat. It is understood to be counter-revolutionary because it opens up divisions within the movement of who is being represented and why. So Patima expresses in section 6, your solidarity, it seems, is anchored by undermining black women's struggle. And this is an old dichotomy women in protest culture have had to endure. In this section, she positions herself as the black male, telling women that their issues will divide black people, and that their personal concerns must wait, and that everything will fall into place once systematic racism has been tackled. The inability to articulate a multiplicity of struggles stems from the return to Biko's black consciousness, rather than committed attempts to creating a new intersecting understanding of black solidarity. So my argument makes use of African American theorist Michelle Wright's differentiation between blackness as a construct and blackness as phenomenological, in order to show that the rhetoric used during the Feminism 4 protest has not progressed past Biko's notion of blackness to include those in the contemporary moment who perceive of and perform themselves as black, namely black female and black queer individuals. Black solidarity was taken up by Feminism 4, or black solidarity, black consciousness, was taken up by Feminism 4 as a construct, something with set ideas and values and a historical context. If we map out the elements of black consciousness, Odera Oruka's definition of it is usually referred to as, it speaks that it is a black man's realization that his world is filled with an anti-black social reality. It is the black man's recognition of himself as black and to be accepting and proud of this, followed by his urge to annihilate the social reality which oppresses him, in order to move towards the creation of a new reality as a movement toward a universal humanism. Very important key tenets in moving towards and thinking about now as steps towards decolonization. Black consciousness as a movement realized that the most effective tool of apartheid as a system was black solidarity. Apartheid's success lay in its emphasis on the division between races and its ability to constantly reinforce the negative self-image that Oruka refers to in order to separate the black population. This meant that the movement redefined black as the racial marker to include all South Africans on the receiving end of historical discrimination grounded in race. Black consciousness operates in the same manner as other global discourses, in that it sought to create a collective identity as a means to resist oppression. The movement denied, however, in its decision to foreground race as the primary form of oppression, the movement denied the existence of intersecting experiences of oppression such as class, gender, and sexual orientation. This construction of blackness is rooted in as a defining moment of collective blackness in our country's history. Similarly to how the Black Power movement in the US is perceived and how negritude is understood within the Afro-Caribbean frame. But it is narrated from the perspective of black men. And this is because men are perceived as the leaders and as the agents of the collective identity. Women are awarded a secondary status within the movement. When the rhetoric used equates man to mean both male and to mean all of humanity, by using the generic term male in its mandate, women are from the onset excluded from its language. and therefore excluded from the space in which this rhetoric is taken up. This ambiguous status of black women allows them to be silenced. Their dual positioning as women and as black confines them to an anxiety between feeling of self-recognition and uniqueness, and therefore similar to the people that they are, to the people within the Black consciousness movement, and on the other hand feeling very different because their experiences of patriarchy, rape culture, sexism and misogyny are not articulated within the space. As Patuma puts it in section 5, she cannot tell if she's breaking bread or she's being poisoned. In section 5, Patuma asks the implied reader, how come references to a revolution are limited to Biko, Fanon, and Malcolm? There's no mention of any strong female revolutionaries such as Winnie Madikizela Mandela. And the repetition of this rhetoric driven by men endangers her. She experiences it not as an emancipatory politics, but rather like venom in the implied reader's mouth. This is because the manner in which their politics is performed acts as a means of erasing her experiences as a black queer woman. It is clear that the ideal role of the black woman within black consciousness organizations and rhetoric is marked largely by silence and absence. Women who were involved in the struggle were celebrated as wives and daughters and mothers, overall as psychological and material support for the male-orientated struggle. For Patuma, a woman's place in black solidarity, as she sets out here, is one of complicity, marked by Pompoms, struggle songs, and placards. Women opposition to validate and support the movement's male leaders, but not to speak out about their own politics. The revolution doesn't need any sass and feminist noise. In a similar manner to the way Biko's black consciousness used race as a determinant of solidarity against apartheid, Business Ball used a similar rhetoric in their overarching narrative against economic oppression. And an overarching narrative was used, forgetting that the origins and strengths of the movement lay in its various intersections. The movement made use of Biko and the class of 76 to show that the issue of inaccessible tertiary education we as students are facing now is rooted in the failure of transformation following apartheid's end. Despite the media and public appearances that women and the LGBTI community were well represented, and at times leading the movement, it was only when they spoke to the intersection of their oppression that was linked to financial exclusion and class inequality. So, Wright introduces a concept of phenomenology of blackness, which allows for an understanding of black solidarity that is capable of including these experiences, or at least exposing their absence. In looking at how blackness is being imagined in epiphenomenal time or the now, we're able to draw from moments on our past but not limit them to being the only discourse suited to understanding blackness. The phenomenology of Patuma's writing is her projection of her own experience of contemporary protest culture onto the constructed backdrop of black solidarity. Her experiences drive her poetry and speak where her politics are silenced. In this, her poetry and her literature becomes her politics, and by extension a space where she is able to perform herself as a black queer woman. Patuma's phenomenological approach to blackness is evident in section 2, where she assures the reader that he can assert his position without negating her presence, and take up space without making her invisible. It's important to remember that black consciousness gave voice to a specific black experience of oppression, that of the man, as previously stated, because they are foregrounded as leaders and assumed to be the agents of the collective. In conclusion, a one-size-fits-all notion of black solidarity does not work. Wright stresses the importance of understanding blackness and its collectiveness as the intersection of constructs that locate the black collective in history and in the specific moment in which blackness is being imagined. In a protest environment dominated by the constructed and largely patriarchal philosophies of Biko and Fanon, a black queer woman such as Koleka Putuma finds herself in between a position of complacent participation and political erasure, unable to make her voice heard at the barricades and during the shutdowns of Feesmas Hall, where she was only expected to produce pom-poms and struggle songs. Putuma turned to poetry and literature as a means to make her voice heard. By taking seriously the critiques that Putuma puts forward, we can hope to develop a solidarity that encapsulates blackness in all its intersections.
Mohamed from the University of Cape Town. The paper is titled For the Decolonial Feminist Disability Studies for Southern Africa.
I have a very dense presentation, so you'll see there's lots of stuff on the slides because that's kind of how I think, with lots of stuff. And I want to urge you to make authentic connections between gender, race, disability, class as well as disability, because when we speak, we frequently forget that disability very often is the grounds through which we produce normativity. That without an attempt to think about what the ends of the continuum of the normative is, how we understand and how we navigate through the world makes very little sense. And very frequently, decolonial thinkers, decolonial or post-colonial, depending on which genealogy you choose, feminist thinkers ignore the importance of disability as an analytic. Now, I want to start with a story. Can I stand? Yeah. Because I feel like one sort of misses something when you don't see each other's faces. So I want to start with a story. I was in a psychology class in my undergraduate years, my third year class, a social psychology class. And my lecturer, Kopana Ratali at the time, was extolling the virtues of Lacan. And he's this fantastic theorist, and he's written this text about how we come to know ourselves as separate from the world when we see ourselves in a mirror. And my question was, what if you can't see? And this started a quest for me. In reading theory, in reading the way in which we think we understand the world, the tools through which we understand the world, very frequently it's premised upon a normative conception of what the body is, beyond gender, beyond race. How we imagine the subjects within our text, who animate our text, are frequently people who inhabit very particular forms of embodiment. To say that the grounds for social theory, for example, is premised upon the rational white male subject is to think through a very, very particular form of embodiment, very limited, universal form of embodiment. And when we do that, we erase universes of experience. And disability is a way to get us into that. So that's one story. That our social theory is fundamentally, crucially flawed, which we know. You wouldn't be sitting in this room if you didn't know that. It's at every level. It's just completely misrecognizes the human beings who animate the worlds we're trying to understand, the human beings who negotiate material realities, psychic realities, social realities in very, very particular ways. It's one story. The second story is much, much more recent. So I ran a community-based organization for women in a place called Blikkiesdorp in the Western Cape. It was a housing scheme, a temporary housing scheme that was materialized by a post-apartheid government. And you know, our governments are provincial, but it was post-apartheid. And what this place looks like is, it's astonishing when you in the space to think that human beings sat in rooms, probably rooms very much like this, cozy, comfortable rooms, and imagined forms of life would emerge from a space that looks like the very worst we could imagine for our others. They're tiny. They're like 2 by 3. These tiny spaces that entire families are supposed to live in. They look like shacks. 4 of these, and people call them hawker, right? Cages. They don't call them houses. They don't call them homes. 4 of these spaces share one toilet, share one tap. The roads are sandy and rocky, and this material reality has very particular effects if you inhabit a body that requires assistance. One of the women shared a story. She had 2 kids. Well, she had one kid who was in a wheelchair, and then she was in an accident, and she was pregnant at the time, and the child had an intellectual disability. And then she was relocated to this temporary housing space that has been in existence for 9 years. Very temporary, of course. And her child in a wheelchair could not use the toilet, could not navigate the sandy, stony space, could not enter into the doorway of these really, really meager spaces, could not move around in a 3 by 4 room, which is the entirety of the house. And her 2 children could not play with each other. Children need space to play with each other, very particular kinds of space. And she had to give the child up for adoption. So the material realities we produce for people are just the way in which we organize the material world when we do not think of multiple forms of embodiment produces effects. And they produce very frequently effects within black lives that are not manifested in the same way within white lives. Within white lives. And this, of course, is a generalization. It's not true for everybody, because one has to think about the intersection of race and class. So you have the connection there between how black people are imagined and how particular forms of bodies are imagined, because of course black people are imagined as people whose sensibilities are a lot more numb, right? When you are white or you become middle class, if you're a black middle class, you become hypersensible. Your body is this object that has to be soothed at all times. It has to smell a particular way. It has to be touched in particular ways. But if we imagine black life, it's true, right? You're going to every sense has to be soothed, every sense has to be cared for. When you disrupt space in particular ways, the way in which throwing feces on the statue of Rhodes, for example, is a disruption of a hyper-aestheticized space. It's breaking up an ordinary form of aesthetics that assumes the soothing of a self that is so hypersensible that any inconvenience is to be removed from the status of being a full person. But of course, when we imagine black lives and how black lives ought to live, it's okay for them to live with their shit in the streets and in their homes in very particular ways. So we want a different world, we have to change it, right? Okay. So that's one story. A family that no longer can exist because the space that was provided for life to proceed is not a space that is habitable for a family where there are multiple forms of embodiment, multiple kinds of psychoaffective relations to the world. another story. One of my friends, also who found herself relocated in the space, but a very, very long history of violence. There's many black women have very long histories of violence. She was raped as a teenager. Her daughter was raped. Her granddaughter at 4 years old was raped. They lots of, I mean, and you know, we ourselves, many of us can identify with the effects of gender-based violence, sexual violence, for example, and the ways in which this produces psychoaffective impairments of very particular sorts. Yes, it produces survival, the possibilities to inhabit a discourse of survival, but it also produces post-traumatic stress disorders. If you're living in the townships or in spaces where violence is endemic, where poverty, drug abuse, etc., is normative, is part of the everyday. You are, you know, when we speak about trauma, this is a way of impairing psychoaffective lives, and so disability is being created by structural violence. But very little disability theory makes the connection to structural violence, because most disability theory is northern, comes from northern thinkers. This is true globally, it's true within Southern Africa. So very little disability theory makes interesting connections to race, makes very little connections to gender. There's disability studies, feminist disability studies theory in the North, but very little that thinks through what it would mean for it to be decolonial, what it would mean for a disability studies theory that takes very, very seriously the structural conditions in the world beyond multiple forms of embodiment. So those are my stories, right? So the WHO estimates that if you include people under 15, that over 1 billion people have disabilities in the world. This is a sizable population. If you're not thinking about disability as an ordinary part of an analysis, you too are part, as I am, I'm as complicit as everybody else, you too are erasing, you too are acting, you too are producing an epistemological erasure. 80% of the people with disabilities live in the global south. As with most of our theory, most of the theory we are in conversation with, we are arguing against, most of the theory comes from the global north, and this has epistemic effects. It means that the way in which geopolitical relations relations, settler colonialisms, etc., not only respond to disability, because most northern theory is based on the response to disability. The social model of disability is about society that does not produce habitable worlds, for people with multiple forms of impairment, and this is about a response to disability rather than a sensibility that thinks it's possible to prevent impairment to start with. The way in which the world is organized in ways that does not take seriously the fragility of people in the South's bodies, psyches, etc., etc. Most of the ways in which labor is organized is about using up the bodies, the minds, the psychics, the imaginative lives of black people. And unless you have a decolonial position to start with, and for me, there are multiple sort of genealogies of thinking decoloniality, and one should, well, for me, I treat it as a sort of a question rather than a certainty, like a certainty as to what the decolonial looks like in a particular analysis at a particular time, right? But unless you're doing that, you cannot make the connection to larger So you do need to have a decolonial perspective. Disability runs through every aspect of our lives. I don't know about you. I'm going to tell you more stories, right? When I was growing up, and still, the ways in which one is regulated in sort of ordinarily is through the use of disability discourse. Like, what are you doing? Are you deaf? Can't you hear me? Why are you walking like that? Are you crippled? And this is language that's not. And disability, unlike race and gender, which is invisibilized, is ubiquitous within popular culture. Who's watched Wonder Woman? So Isabel Moreau. Isabel Moreau, you know the character Isabel Moreau, right? And she's disfigured, and her disfigurement is supposed to act as a metaphor for a particular kind of subject. It's the most brute kind of essentialism, where and Mitchell and Snyder call this narrative prosthesis, where disability acts as a metaphor that stands in for social relations in particular ways within forms of popular culture. So we see people with disabilities within popular culture everywhere. Oedipus, Captain Hook, etc., etc. Popular culture is replete with stereotypes about disability. The lived experience of impairment, however, disappears. So, not having an arm, not having vision, not being able to hear, having a face that is scarred. Because all I sat there and I thought is like, who did that to this woman? Because there's a history of gender-based violence, but if you're reading it within the tropes that the film sets up for you, you're reading this as a character that's disfigured and therefore she's evil. So there's an entire history that is erased. Okay, so disability is a very potent analytic. There's very little research on gender, on the intersection of gender, race and disability at the very least, because there are different national histories, there are very different ethnic relationships, etc., etc. Where there are intersections, for example, within, there have been some anthropologists who've done some really lovely close studies, on disability, and that's sort of context specific. But very frequently what one sees is either sort of like within Africa, like a kind of Afro-romanticism or Afro-pessimism. They have deformed cultures, and so therefore they are evil to the people with disabilities. Oh, they have it's all lovely and wonderful, and therefore people with disabilities are the most awesome. And so again, one needs a kind of decolonial understanding to read this closely in a particular. I don't think I'm going to get done. How am I doing time? Okay. So I'm not going to do like all the ways in which colonialism produced disability, because you're going to find that out, right? But so why does it matter to think about disability as intellectually as a scholarly project? And my presentation is mostly about inciting the desire to do that, rather than to tell you how to do it, because I think that epistemic plurality is a necessity if we're going to imagine new worlds. But so at the ontological level, to think about disability is to take difference seriously, and to try and work out ontologies of difference that doesn't hierarchize difference, but rather imagines a world where difference is the grounds for the grounds for social life, where being different, having different kinds of bodies with different possibilities, different psyches, different affective lives, people with depression, people who learn kinesthetically, who learn through touch and other ways, not just through rote learning or reading, etc., etc. If we imagine that most people do not fit normative idealizations of what it means to be human, and not treat that difference as meaning that someone is further away from personhood or further away from the category of the human, will produce more life-giving worlds. So at the ontological level, this matters. At the epistemological level, how we know the world differs. We know that particular forms of knowing, and as feminists, these are ideas that we're very familiar with. That there are particular ways of knowing are legitimated and authorized. But if we inhabit bodies and psyches that differ, then surely how we know differs. How we know differs, what becomes possible to say differs. What becomes possible to say differs, and so our epistemologies have to change. What does it mean if somebody, mode of communication is to sign? What does it mean if someone's relationship to the world is not through the oculocentric, not through the visual, which most of our social theory privileges? The visual is the most privileged sense within the Western canon. What happens if we have to begin to think ordinarily, not as an exception, not as an add-on, but to treat the multiplicity of life, the multiplicity of the bodies through which we understand the way we understand the world as ordinarily different epistemological possibilities emerge. It's political. Most of the desire to be incorporated into the social or to belong in the nation state is premised on the idea of a political economy that is receptive to us. But if you're a person who is never going to be productive in the economy, if you're thinking through people who will never, because they have intellectual disabilities and the forms of labor that's available to them, the forms of labor that's available to them are forms of labor that they're never going to inhabit, that the laboring subject is not the only subject, then how we imagine who has the rights to the nation state changes. And this is profoundly political. It's to reorganize the social contract at its most basic level. And we know we live in economies political economies, where you have to be a particular kind of subject, a subject who's had to go to university and experience all kinds. Some people are never ever going to get here, and if you accord them full personhood, full rights and responsibility from the state, what does that mean for the rest of us? I mean, because it changes profoundly what it means then to inhabit the state. So it changes how we think, the political grounds of anything. The ethical. If some of us are not subjects, and very people who, because some of us are not subjects, right? And we kind of think of ourselves as not impaired, perhaps, but we know we live in political economies that have disabled us in particular ways. But how we imagine the good life and our rights and our duties to each other shifts profoundly. So it's not instrumental relations that allow you a relation to the state. You don't have to be a taxpayer to have an entitlement to have an entitlement to a good life, to life-giving and life-thriving policies. We want worlds in which we can thrive, right? And so this changes how we think about what is the ethical. If you can say, like Peter Singer, who is one of the foremost philosophers in the US, says that animals have more rights than people with disabilities. This is profound, and it's an ethics, right? It's ethical. This is, to me, it's a profoundly unethical statement, because where does that end? Like, where does it end when we're producing worlds through which that takes the grounds for subjectivity to be something that is instantiated by hierarchy, which Le Borgnez tells us that coloniality, what it did most profoundly was produce social worlds through which hierarchy makes sense. Who is entitled and who is not entitled, and who is rights over rather than rights along with. If you think through disability, and you have to think at the ends of this continuum, right, where you're saying, no, this is someone who's never going to be this thing that we imagine as the ideal subject, this productive subject, which we're all striving so hard to be busy for, and hurting ourselves and our psyches and our lives. But if you're imagining that this person is entitled to a good life in the same way as you are, this profoundly shifts your ethical focus. And then for us, because we're academics, the methodological, so I started thinking about this a few years ago, and then I wanted people to be in conversation with, and there were so few texts on gender and disability, so I edited a special issue on gender and disability for Gender, the Feminist journal, with Tammy Schaefer. And something I found fascinating, and I hadn't thought of at the time, prior to that, was nobody spoke about what it means to explore the lives of people with disabilities as a practice of, social science or literature, etc. But like to interrogate the methodological lenses. Like nobody spoke about methodological, and that was astonishing to me, because you can't speak about people with disabilities as if they're this monolithic category. It's very different interacting with somebody who has a visual impairment. It's very different interacting with somebody who has cerebral palsy, for example, and has to move around all the time. It's very different. So the embodied encounter of research changes depending on the person you're doing research with. So that means that how we respond to people has to be flexible. It has to be creative. You can't write an account of research where you are this authoritative person. The interviews were for about an hour, and etc., etc. No, really? No. There's something wrong if you're not talking about how sometimes you feel like you just don't know what you're doing. Very frequently. I get the language wrong all the time, and I think about this stuff a lot, right? I get the language wrong all the time. Am I, stepping into stigma, reproducing stigma? All of these form part of the research encounter, and to not speak about it, to erase it, to treat it as if the research encounters were smooth and not incoherent and not scary sometimes. Well, sometimes you want to feel like you're a good person, but you're not always. You do get it wrong. I've gotten it wrong. And that's a problem. It means we're lying. Because we're imagining the subject on the other side, and because most frequently we only think in terms of visible, we recognize visible disabilities, right? So disabilities that you can sort of see. We don't really work very closely with the complexity of life. I think I'm at time. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, so Marzia and Milazzo is going to present from Vanderbilt, who are currently known as Rhodes, will present Patriarchy, Masters, Decoloniality, Problematizing, Decolonial, Masculinist Critiques of Intersectionality.
Thank you. So I don't have a PowerPoint. I'm just going to be staying here. So let me just tell you briefly the inspiration for this paper came last year. I attended a conference, a decoloniality conference at UNISA, and Ramon Grosfoguel and Sandy Hira, two decolonial scholars, gave a talk titled Decolonizing Intersectionality the day after the conference, which sparked, the idea for this paper. Later, I was asked to contribute to a volume on intersectionality, which never materialized for two reasons. One, I wasn't given enough time to actually develop the paper. And two, as a white European woman, I felt very aware of the narrative of white women saving black women from black men and white saviorism more broadly. I felt wary about engaging masculinist critiques of intersectionality by men of color. And yet, nonetheless, why I didn't contribute to the volume, I kept thinking about this. So basically, this is an unpublished paper of what I've been thinking about and what I welcome critique. That's what I'm saying. So in this paper, I want to take to task recent critiques of Kimberly Crenshaw's theory of intersectionality that are produced in decolonial philosophy by male scholars. So I examined Grosfoguel's talk, Decolonizing Intersectionality, which, as I mentioned, was delivered at UNISA in August 2016 as part of the Africa Decolonial Research Network, as well as Sanju Hira's essay titled A Decolonial Critique of Intersectionality, which is forthcoming in his new book, and Tommy Curry's talk, The Limits of the Intersectional Axiom, which you can listen to online, as well as his forthcoming article, Black Studies, Not Morality, Anti-Black Racism, Neoliberal Cooptation, and the Challenge to Black Studies Under the Intersectional Axiom. So that's the long title. So while these critiques present themselves as decolonial, I argue that they decontextualize the theory of intersectionality, and in doing so, ironically collude with white feminists' appropriations of the theory. The arguments that Curry, Grosfoguel, and Hira put forth not only sideline Crenshaw's understanding of intersectionality itself, but they also silence precisely the interlocking systems of oppression experienced by women of color that the theory of intersectionality gives voice to. So, given this silencing, I want to begin not with the critiques of the theory of intersectionality, but with the theory of intersectionality itself, also because I feel often we talk about intersectionality, but we don't go back to the original texts where the theory was actually developed. So Kimberly Crenshaw, a well-known US legal scholar and one of the founders of critical race theory, first developed the theory of intersectionality in a 1989 article titled Demarginalizing the Intersections of Race and Gender, a black feminist critique of anti-discrimination doctrine, feminist theory, and anti-racist politics. So in this article, Crenshaw shows that racial discrimination cases, right, and she's looking at this obviously from a legal perspective. So racial discrimination cases tend to privilege the experiences of black men, while sex or / gender discrimination cases tended to privilege the experiences of white women. This way, she shows how the law marginalizes the experiences of black women who are burdened by multiple oppressions. She also shows how this marginalization affects the position of black women beyond the sphere of law. She argues that, quote, black women are sometimes excluded from feminist theory and anti-racist policy discourse because both are predicated on a discrete set of experiences that often does not accurately reflect the interaction of race and gender, end of quote. So simply including black women in the structure of analysis that already exists does not resolve the problem, Crenshaw contends, because the intersection of race and gender is greater than the sum of its parts. Therefore, in Crenshaw's view, analyses that do not consider intersectionality fail to sufficiently capture the complex ways in which women of color are subordinated. So Crenshaw provides a long list of examples across, and she's written at least 10 articles that engage intersectionality. And they're going to be published next year in one collective volume. So Crenshaw provides a variety of examples to demonstrate the particular challenges that women of color face, and that demonstrate that these challenges are not equal to those faced by white women or men of color. So for example, she shows how women of color are often reluctant to call the police in cases of domestic violence because the police are hostile to communities of color, and because women often do not want to expose their partners within a white supremacist context in which men of color are already stigmatized. And she also shows how in legal cases, for example, the interracial rape of white women is treated more seriously than the interracial rape of black women. But for me, perhaps the most illuminating examples of the intersectional dimensions of black women's oppression that Crenshaw provides are actually stories about employment discrimination. So, for example, in Demarginalizing the Intersections of Race and Gender, she talks about a 1976 case, De Graffenried versus General Motors. In this case, 5 black women sued General Motors for discriminating specifically against black women. But the court dismissed the case despite the fact that General Motors had hired no women prior to 1964, and even after 1970, they had a record of firing black women through their seniority-based layoff system. But the court ruled that the claim of sex discrimination was unfounded because General Motors did have white women, did hire white women, and the court also dismissed the race discrimination complaint because the company did hire black men. So through this case, I think Crenshaw illustrates brilliantly the need for an intersectional framework that may capture the insidious ways in which black women are not only discriminated against, but also rendered invisible within U.S. existing legal frameworks. So while the term intersectionality was coined by Crenshaw, black women have argued at least since the 70s that categories such as race, gender, and class are not separated and stable, but interconnected and variable. To cite only a few, Toni Kádár-Bambara does this in the anthology The Black Woman, Angela Davis in Women, Race, and Class, or Hazel Carby in White Woman Listen, Patricia Hills Collins in her work. So in the 80s and 90s, the interventions of women of color forced many white feminist scholars to abandon the illusion that the category woman is uniform and holds primary as a social category. At the same time, as Barbara Tomlinson has shown, rather than making racial power visible, many white feminists continue to appropriate intersectionality for their own ends in scholarship that enforces color blindness. They, or shall I say we, also often silence the fact that black women have been at the forefront of theorizing multiple oppressions, thereby engaging in what Tomlinson calls asset stripping, that is, the intellectual theft of the cultural and theoretical contributions by women of color. In other words, there's tons of scholarship on intersectionality and feminist scholarship, but often the women who have actually theorized this, right? Crenshaw doesn't appear at all, or Angela Davis doesn't appear at all. So Tomlinson also shows that white feminists who appropriate intersectionality often engage in what she calls the straw person fallacy, that is, misinterpreting the arguments of the scholar they critique by taking them out of context. As she writes, quote, "The critics covertly replace the target's precise argument with false but superficially similar claims that they discredit," end of quote. Now, I argue that some of the decolonial critiques of intersectionality that I'm about to examine replicates these logics. Moreover, while these critiques specifically purport to problematize intersectionality per se, in reality, they reproduce arguments that view addressing gender oppression as divisive and detrimental to anti-racist struggles. In other words, these critics rarely engage the theory of intersectionality per se, but instead often use it as a starting point for delegitimizing women of color's claims about gender oppression, and in some cases to delegitimize black feminism altogether. For example, in Decolonizing Intersectionality, the talk that I just mentioned that Grossfogel gave at UNISA, Grossfogel starts by asserting that he's not denying gender-based oppression, but that the theory of intersectionality, in his own words, moved backward things that were already moving forward. End of quote. He then moves on to stigmatizing complaints about gender discrimination within anti-racist movements, mentioning specifically the example of decolonizing the university. He states, and I'm quoting, "So you go into a struggle where the struggle is, let's say, decolonizing the university, Rhodes must fall. And then suddenly comes someone who says, no, we need now to raise the issue of gender or sexuality or LGBT. And then suddenly the focus of the struggle gets derailed into a kind of law of the jungle. Instead of building solidarity, people are fighting each other in terms of Olympics of oppression.
And when you open your eyes, the movement is dead. And this is happening not only in South Africa, it's happening everywhere today. End of quote. Grossvogel here stigmatizes constituencies who voice concerns about gender or sexual discrimination within anti-racist movements. At the same time, he also silences Crenshaw's theorization of intersectionality by never actually referencing her work, so having a talk titled Decolonizing Intersectionality, where Crenshaw is addressed but never quoted or cited, or what she actually means by intersectionality is not addressed in the first place. Thereby, I believe, engaging precisely in what Tomlinson calls the straw person fallacy. The specific analysis of intersectionality in Grossvogel's talk never materializes, but is instead transformed into a critique of the seemingly disruptive function that condemnations of patriarchy hold within decolonial movements. Now, in the essay A Decolonial Critique of Intersectionality, Sandhu Hira comparably critiques intersectionality without ever citing Crenshaw's work, and similarly argues that intersectionality, in his own words, quote, has created a passport for good and bad activism by placing gender discrimination at the same level as race discrimination. He contends that, quote, the experience of racism is of totally different nature than the experience of patriarchy, and that intersectionality levels all oppressions. These are his words. These statements, I believe, overlook Crenshaw's contribution in understanding how race and gender oppression readily intersect in the lives of women of color. Crenshaw never argues that patriarchy trumps racism, but rather that black women experience a particularly insidious form of discrimination that is not accounted for in traditional legal discourse or in theory, in fact. Hira then sidelines how the theory of intersectionality does away precisely with conceiving race and gender as binaries, and instead highlights how the racial discrimination that women of color experience is aggravated by the interlocking systems of race and gender oppression. Rather than silencing the primacy of racism, intersectionality is concerned with making visible the complex ways in which racialized oppression operates in the lives of black women. Grossvogel and Hira instead brand intersectional analysis as detrimental and accuse them of diluting the effectiveness of anti-racist struggles. Now, Kimberly Crenshaw, in Mapping the Margins, indirectly addresses critiques by men of color that aim to silence black women's concerns, although she does this not within the context of anti-racist struggles per se, but within the specific context of domestic violence. In the article, she contends that the oppression that black women experience is often suppressed in favor of protecting the political or cultural interests of their communities. She writes that, quote, people of color often must weigh their interests in avoiding issues that might reinforce distorted public perceptions against the need to address and acknowledge inter-community problems, end of quote. As an example, she cites the controversy over Alice Walker's novel, The Color Purple, which some condemned for providing a negative representation of black men. Crenshaw sees this critique as an attempt to silence discussions of violence against black women. The problem, as Crenshaw sees it, is not Walker's novel per se, but the fact that there are few positive and complex representations of black masculinity in the mainstream, so that black women sometimes feel the need to be quiet about their experiences of violence so as not to reinforce racist stereotypes about black men. As she writes, quote, the political imperatives of a narrowly focused anti-racist strategy support other practices that isolate women of color. In a similar move, I believe Grossvogel and Hira isolate black women's concerns by representing critiques of patriarchy as illegitimate. Tommy Curry, in his essay Black Studies Not Morality, meanwhile goes as far as denying the fact that some men of color also benefit from and are complicit with patriarchy. In the essay, he argues that, quote, black men fall outside the historical category of patriarchy and remain some of its greatest victims, end of quote. He contends that black men, for example, within the Black Power movement of the 1970s, have historically supported black women's struggles. He says that they have unilaterally supported black women's struggles rather than aligning themselves with white patriarchal norms. In his view, intersectionality silences black male alliances to black women's struggles as well as scapegoats black men. To corroborate his claim, Curry cites Elaine Brown, who argued that black feminism, quote, okay, this is in, actually I don't know the original quote, he quotes Elaine Brown saying that black feminism is anti-male and completely separated from the masses, end of quote. Curry laments the fact that critiques of black feminism by black men are delegitimized and branded as sexist or masculinist. Moreover, he argues that in contrast with Crenshaw's positing of black men as privileged in comparison with black women, quote, black men are empirically disadvantaged vis-a-vis black women in terms of mortality, employment, education, incarceration, and so forth, end of quote. So as you can see even here, in this essay and in the talk, they're supposedly about intersectionality, but they end up tackling actually black feminism at large, right? So now, I believe that Curry has a point when he argues that the privileges that black men experience, and this is in the US context, but I think it's also global, of course, the privileges that black men experience vis-a-vis black women need to be qualified rather than perceived as absolute, especially within a context in which black men, alongside indigenous men in the United States, face the highest incarceration rates as well as death rates at the hand of the police. At the same time, studies have shown that it is not true that black women in the US are advantaged when it comes to income and employment. For example, African American women in 2010 earned 69%, while African American men earned 74% of what white men earned. White women earned 80% of the 100% that, so privileged above both black men and black women. Moreover, women of color are the fastest growing population in the U.S. penal system, as Crenshaw herself writes in a 2012 article titled From Private Violence to Mass Incarceration, Thinking Intersectionally About Women, Race, and Social Control. In this essay, Crenshaw shows that while African American women constitute only 7% of the California population, they constitute more than 70% of women and girls held in some California detention centers. Black women also represent 28% of all women held in state prisons, as well as 28% of women held on parole. And black women are 6.9 times more likely than white women to be incarcerated. Now, this might not be as high as the rates of black men, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't matter, right? So at the same time, the killings of black women at the hand of law enforcement or in prisons rarely get media attention, a fact that has led Crenshaw to start the Say Your Name campaign. I don't know if you know the Say Your Name, yeah. In an attempt to call attention to how the deaths of black women are often rendered invisible. Crenshaw argues that the discourse of the endangered black male sidelines the ways in which black women are also under attack. And this in turn has led to an understudying of the vulnerabilities that black women experience in the penal system within academic circles. This is Crenshaw's argument. Now, to call attention to these realities, as Crenshaw and other black feminist scholars have done and continue to do, I believe is not to be anti-male, but is a quest to give voice to the marginalization of women of color in all social spheres, precisely the marginalization and silencing that I believe decolonial scholars such as Carrera and Gross-Fogel continue in their own work. Thank you.
So I'll take a round of 5 comments or questions, and then we can have a round of responses.
It's really the thesis about black feminism is under attack was very, very, very powerful, and it was a terrific paper. But it's just one thing I'm anxious about, and that is the way that we talk about intellectual theft, and there's a sort of general question about who owns a theory, but there's also a kind of problem in the attributing of intersectionality simply to Kimberly Crenshaw. because I think Teresa de Lauritis, who's a white American academic, talked about the intersecting nexus of oppressions in, I think it was 1985. So, so white feminists have, or a white feminist has started that discussion. So I just, it doesn't really matter very much, but I just wonder how much is at stake for you in talking about the theory is absolutely owned by black feminists. I think Kimberly Crenshaw elaborated it, but I think that Teresa de Lauritis' argument was partly about, she didn't focus on black oppression simply, but what she also talked about, which was very useful for me in my early teaching, was the way in which white men would deliver racism in a different way from the way white women would deliver racism. So their gender was kind of implicated in the way they oppressed, or the way they intimidated, or the way they subordinated people. So I think that's another aspect that Crenshaw isn't particularly necessarily interested in, but I think that's a very important aspect of intersectionality that we also need to talk about, not simply about the experience of oppression, but in the way that these things are delivered, and delivered in these complexly different ways. So I wonder if that's of any use to you.
Well, I would just turn the question around and I would ask you, what is at stake for you in wanting to?
Well, that's why I'm so nervous.
In wanting
yes.
to, introduce the
Uh-huh.
contribution of a white woman into a theory that, as I said, Crenshaw might have coined the term, but we can go back not just to works by black women and also, Chicana women. If we take Gloria Anzaldua's Borderlands, for example, from 86,
Yeah.
she never talks about interlocking of oppressions, but it's all about the multiplicity of oppressions, in fact, for women of color. But we could also go back to Du Bois, and here's where I agree with Curry when he says that, some men of color have also, without using the term, theorized multiple oppressions. But when I was talking about, I wasn't talking about black feminism actually being under attack. When I mentioned that, I was specifically talking about black women being actually physically killed with impunity. But of course, these things are all interconnected, right? And I think it's very problematic to precisely erase, to keep perpetuating this asset stripping, because it's not just a matter of, who falls into our footnotes, which of course it does matter, right? That we all, and this is like a more global problem. It's not just about the theory of intersectionality, but this is about the whole history of European art. Like where did Picasso got his ideas from, and where did surrealism come from, and so there's a larger history of asset stripping from black people that started with colonialism that I think white feminists often reproduce. So Tomlinson writes that this is not just about, having accurate footnotes where we actually respect the work enough that we read the original source. This is also about asset stripping. It's not just metaphorical. This is also about money. This is about who gets tenure. This is about who gets recognition. This is about materiality.
Then I understand.
As well.
I really understand all those things, and you could hear my nervousness in asking the question, but it's because I want to broaden the discussion, and rather than try to keep it. Yes, I think let's just leave it at that. I really agree with all you're saying, but I just don't want an inaccurate silencing of important theorists who we all borrow from. We all borrow from Du Bois, we all borrow from Crenshaw, but we also borrow from Simone de Beauvoir. And no one owns a theory. Black women, white women, novelists have been talking about intersectionality as soon as they started writing, virtually. So So it's very hard
So
to...
why not recognize that?
Well, we do. Well, we try to recognise it, but I don't think we should silence people.
I mean,
in
I've
the
never
pro-
heard
anyway.
of the Lorito before, so, you know, and still you said this is the 1985. I mean, some of these theorists, they came much earlier, but how do we know that the Lorito herself is not also
She just
appropriate?
used that. I don't want to fight about this, but she did use the word intersecting nexus of oppressions, you know, which you know, a few years of UCT graduate students were reading. So, but anyway, let's just stop there.
This question is from Ms. Mohamed in particular. I really liked the presentation that she gave. Yeah, sorry, Dr. Mohamed.
It'll be in the papers.
Sorry, Kharnita.
I have both intellectual and physical disabilities, and I found that at this university, within radical spaces in particular, I think that ableism is so ingrained that people don't even realize like how much they're perpetuating it on a daily basis. Last term I had a course for my politics class, and the majority of people there had never even thought about disability at all, and at this university in particular, it's so, like, we don't have accessible spaces at all, and I think people are aware of it, but they don't really think about it. Like, if it doesn't affect them, it doesn't really concern them. But I found this place to be so exclusionary towards me in particular, because they're like, I can't do stuff, like I can't access places here. And the problem is that you were talking about how we sort of like recognize, you know, physical disabilities, but if your disability is invisible and you pass, then it's not taken as seriously. And I found it to be really humiliating as a woman, as a brown woman, as a queer woman. All those aspects of identity are taken seriously. All those aspects of like the disadvantages that I face in life are taken seriously, except when you throw in disability, because then suddenly that's like you're being unnecessary. Like that is something that we have to deal with right now, you know. And it's really humiliating again, because I have all those things, and then like as a woman in particular, when you're disabled and you're a feminist in particular, I think it kind of perpetuates, like people sort of perceive you as having this double whammy of ineptitude. Like, you're a woman, so you need to be taken care of, but then I don't want to be taken care of because I'm like, I don't want that. But then you do need to be taken care of because you're physically disabled and you're intellectually disabled and you need that care, you need that support. And I suppose I've internalized it to a point where I kind of see it as humiliating. Sorry, I'm just getting to the question. I wanted to ask, do you think that within these spaces, it is the responsibility of disabled people to educate others and to sort of try and reduce these stigmas and reduce the way that people see us? Or do you think that because within this discourse, like, you know, people always say, if you want, like, you should listen to black women, listen to women, listen to queer people, but disabled people have been talking and we're invisible, and people, like, even if they do listen to us, they don't care, you know? And we don't have the energy to keep doing this stuff all the time because it quite literally kills me. So do you feel like it is the responsibility of disabled people to continue these fights, or do you think that able-bodied people should perform the physical labor and the emotional labor to take over that? Or is that kind of like reducing from that kind of activism?
Okay, so I find that's so complicated, because the answer is I don't really know, because I've made errors in my classroom with students with disabilities, and I think about disability all the time. And I really actually don't know. I think as institutions we have to work very, very hard to produce inclusive spaces, but the problem we have is so there's this funny statistic, right? It's either 300,000 or 500,000 children with disabilities, depending on who you've read, will never make it into a school. Right now in South Africa, will never make it into a school. In our universities, less than 1% of students are students with disabilities. So this is really a population that, and this has implications for the kinds of universities we produce, right? Because if less than 1% of students are students who have declared that they have disabilities at any rate, that means that we don't have a professoriate. who makes decisions about inclusivity, to makes decisions about what kinds of institutions we have, that are familiar with disability in intimate ways, in ways that someone like me can only begin to describe. And so we're going to miss stuff. So we're going to miss stuff. You're in the spaces you're in, people are going to miss stuff, and it's not necessary, I would like to believe, it's not because they're intending to humiliate you. Most people in the space are overburdened. They have multiple, and this is not an excuse, right? I don't think, because it's something I'm having to think about very, very, in a very real sense right now. Because I made a boo-boo in a classroom not so long ago, which I was thoughtless, and I'd acted habitually, and the question I have now is, if someone for whom disability is an animating feature of how she thinks, does this? What does this mean? And I don't have an answer yet. Maybe if we were to speak in a month, I might be coherent. But today, really, I really don't have a response. But I also think, so I think on the one hand, there's a what we're talking about are social relations. So, and I would like to believe that people with disabilities have agencies of particular sort. I would like, and so yes, it's going to be exhausting. You're going to have to do some of the activism, but you also can and should demand from your institution that they are a lot more sensitive and a lot more aware. I also think that the problem of stigmatization with disability is, like Christeva says, that the objection happens when you have the breakdown of meaning, right? And so people who theorize the stigma of disability say that what disability produces in their others, who are people who are presumably able-bodied, is a kind of fear that they don't want to face. They don't want to face the fragility of life, the fragility of embodiment, the violence of our economy, because we're in very violent. Our economies are very, 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 very violent. The university is a violent space. It assumes you can produce all the time, and if your psyche is one that requires, Margaret Atwood I can't remember which novel had this beautiful way of phrasing depression, right? And she says, like, fallow periods. So some people have these fallow periods where they have to be rest before they can flourish again. But our institutions don't reckon with fallow periods. You're a machine, and you are expected to be productive all the time, which has an effect when we're in relation to our students. We very frequently don't have the effective resources ourselves to manage I don't know if this is making sense, but we very frequently ourselves don't have the relationship to the institution that allows us the kind of pause to not act habitually. And so, well, I think this rambling has given me a kind of response, actually. That's better. So our institutions people have to sit down and produce thoughtful policies so that becomes habit, so that the policy perhaps saves you for when we're like overburdened, so the structure has to save you. So I think go and fight and get the structure of the university changed. But it's not a real response, so I apologize for that.
I would like to make note, Chelsey, that I am deliberately not engaging with what you presented, because I feel like, how many times must we check you? How many times must we ask you, not even ask you, highlight you about how you're taking up our spaces? And the step that I've taken and a large part of it is self-care, is that I then look at the other white woman in the room to say, why are you not checking your person? Because I'm deliberately not. I can't be having this conversation with white people all the time. And I acknowledge your introduction because that to me was important, because it spoke to that and it also spoke to where you're going with your work. But I'm deliberately not engaging with you. To you other two, I wanted to say thank you very much. I learned a lot. I appreciated what you did. Specifically with, I'm doing a lot of personal work. I lecture at Wits and I'm trying to make my space a lot better. So I've spent a lot of time this year thinking a lot about disability. I did want to perhaps, I know it's a bit of a cheat code, but I spent a lot of time taking down phrases which use instead of these words that I've normalized that are also problematic. If you somehow in your busy lives find the time to make a glossary of terms, or there are so many phrases that I just picked up from how you deliver the work that you do that were just very helpful. So if that's something you may want to look into, it would be something I'd be very interested in getting hold of.
Thank you. I'm only beginning to write now. It's taken a long time, so thank you.
Thank you.
You know, Kharnita, I want to ask you this question that I've been thinking about for a long time. Because I think your point around universities not being inclusive of disabled faculty goes way beyond issues of justice, and to me speak to questions of knowledge. Because all knowledge is ultimately embodied. I mean, no matter what you think, it's got to physically make its way through your brain. Without perception, there is no knowledge, and perception ultimately is embodied. There's no other way to have it until we become, telepathists or something. So when knowledge is produced and created, and institutions of knowledge creation are run by only particularly kinds of bodied people, then there's a universe of knowledge that we are not producing. Or if it is being produced, it's in spaces and places to which the kind of official university narrative is not relating. And I think that's crucial, because ultimately what that's saying is that we're not producing the kind of knowledge we could be producing. So my question to you is, and I've grappled with this a lot, I wanted at one stage to come out as emotionally disabled, and my therapist was like, no, people are going to think you're crazy. And I'm like, yeah, that's why I'm sitting here. I grapple a lot with, would it be important for me to come out as a person who's struggling with post-traumatic stress? And I have occasionally, but never very publicly. But what held me back was the thought that, okay, that's so it is, I mean, I love your emphasis on cognitive and emotional disability, but it's not the same as sitting in a wheelchair. And does one then not detract from people who are forced into other ways of knowing? And I grapple with that a lot. So I just wonder, because we will then could possibly move into a very flaky space, you know?
So there's an emerging decolonial disability studies. It's not feminist for the most part. And one of the ways, and if you want to read a bit, like some of these, it's Helen Mikosha, Sean Gretsch, two people who are writing about soon, inshallah. Who are theorizing the relationship between colonialism and the ways in which colonialism produced disability. And one of this, and some of what they're, like land appropriation produces psychosocial dependencies. And when we begin to think about ways in which we become numbed, we're expected to become numbed, we're not fully feeling people, it throws us out of relationships of empathy. This is a form of impairment that has an effect on sensible life. It has an effect on political life. So I would not think it's flaky. I would think it's radical to say that you are emotionally impaired, because it recognizes, and I think particularly in regards to black life, because the way in which black life, and I know these are gross, vulgar generalizations, of course, right? But the way in which black life is imagined is as not a fully feeling subject.
Well,
and so
there's
to claim
that
the
chapter
space,
as well, exactly.
To claim that you're a fully feeling subject who has had experiences that has delimited the space of feeling, I think is profound. I think there is something really and so and I think the question is like, to whom is it legitimate? To whom is it flaky? Because there are very many sort of pleas for incorporation into the body politic, for incorporation into the social by many people who are thought to be flaky. I mean, I'm reading, well, not reading, I'm like halfway through and I don't think I'm ever going to finish it. It's this text called, oh my God, it's so offensive, and what the text is about is, decrying the call for political correctness and who is being bashed, of course, are black women, queer women, people who are they're being killjoys, right? They're disrupting the space of the ordinary and they're acting like snowflakes. But this is a political question that, the millennial generation is the generation of snowflakes. You've heard this, right? They're also precious, they're also unique. But this fight to be incorporated as a subject who is visible in particular ways is profoundly political. And it's precisely at that point at which an other, whoever the imagined other is, whoever the imagined critical other is, who is going to be entitled to call you a flake for saying, the constant trauma, the constant loss, the constant expectation that we have to operate within spaces that, even as they are receptive, even as they are loving, even as they are supportive, do not fully recognize the forms of life you bring into that space. That this matters is profoundly political. And I would say the person who's saying you're a flake, and this question, everybody wants to be recognized. I think the problem is perhaps there, not with the recognition that one has had a life that has, because it's that intimate life that is profoundly personal, which is the grounds of the political. I think. So yes, you can say that, and I won't say you're a flake. I will not go. Okay.
Phew. Thank you, Kharnita. I think I'm going to sit with. I have a question forming for you, but if there's time, it's not fully formed yet. Chelsey, I missed your session, but my question is for Marzia. And it's a different question from Dorothy's. And my question is about, but perhaps equally unfair.
Nice, fine.
And my question is about, so I recognize what you're talking about, right? I recognize it, I see it. Often, not too often, but I've seen it often enough among the professorate who claim an investment in a decolonial politics, right? So what you're critiquing. So this kind of this. But my question to you is twofold. The first part is around pushing you a little bit to declare what you think this is about, right? So you've traced what you think is being elided, what is being erased, what is being obfuscated, and so on. But I feel like you're holding back something about because 100 years, whatever, 80 years, 60 years, depending on what point we're looking at, after different articulations of kind of African and black and Latina and Chicana and India, whatever, women of color feminisms globally, and after all of the academic scholarship on critiquing the project of kind of masculinist nationalism, right? That kind of, what do you think is going on in this moment that there seems almost a recuperation? What do you think it's about? That there seems to almost be a recuperation of a pre women of color critique of feminism. So right, so it's like all of this stuff by women of color feminists didn't happen, and we're back to that point where you are prone, right? Where the position of black women in the struggle is prone, right? Or where we, you know, so what do you, and I mean, and this is very, it is fascinating for me because it is happening in the midst of a, as you say, of a very visible set of traditions beyond the academy, but also within the academy, of specific traditions of thinking about intersectionality. So why do you think that we're seeing this insistence that gender doesn't matter? Right? Or as many of us get told constantly who work in that decolonial space, that there was no gender on the slave ship. Right? That you know, that there's no gender prior to, you know, the gender kind of happens in the Americas and it doesn't happen anywhere else, and the rest of us are delusional in thinking that, you know, that race is made through gender, through sexual violence. So that's the first part. I don't know if you, okay, sorry, I'm kind of all over the place. The second part that I'm battling with a little bit is, so okay, it seems to me that it's something that's happening within kind of these decolonial programs specifically, but it's also obviously happening beyond them, right? In very specific ways. And I'm wondering about how we make, okay, so the first part is about, okay, why do you think it's happening? Like, what do you think that's about, right? The second part is a slight unease around the connection between this, I don't even know what to call it, recuperative, backlash, I don't know, because it's like this pre-feminist almost imagination. But also just a slight unease around whether it in fact is a response specifically to black feminism, and if it is, what that space is that makes it safe to perform in specific decolonial spaces rather than others. Am I making sense? No.
This last part.
Okay. So we're at a conference that's called Rethinking African Feminisms, right? It's not rethinking black feminisms, right? And I'm a little, and I, you know, the people who've heard me raise this before, I apologize, because it's kind of my constant thing that I feel like those of us who are kind of continental feminists have to constantly say. I just worry a little bit when the African feminist just becomes black feminism, right? By which I mean, if we take the global work of kind of feminists of color in the world, I worry about what's happening when feminisms of color, and when at a colloquium, when we talk about African feminisms, we talk about black feminisms only as it exists, or traditions and trajectories only as they exist of the continent as speaking for all black feminisms, or for all feminisms in the world. So I'm thinking, for example, that you're talking about kind of Grosvenor et al.'s erasure of Crenshaw, which I take, right? Because they would not be as reckless with traditions of thinking that have been popularized or coined by specific men in that trajectory. Like they say Biko, they say Fanon. They don't, even when they recognize that actually maybe Bikiana coined something or Rampele coined something, but it comes from BC there, but they'll say Biko, right? Even if Biko isn't in Biko specifically, it's just someone that stands for that tradition, right? But they won't say Crenshaw, and then there's absolutely no recognition that Nyaimega is even a thing in the world, right? And so I wonder then, as part of that critique, how we,
the value of not falling into the trap also then of thinking of okay, so we defend Crenshaw, but Crenshaw is not an African feminist. Right? And so, well, she is, but she isn't. As in, she doesn't work in the tradition of the thing we call African feminism, right? Is she an African feminist? Yes, but in a different definition of African, right? So I'm talking about African feminism, the body of thought and scholarship on movements, right? So I mean in that sense. So I guess part of me is saying, okay, what do you think they're doing, the decolonists are doing? And part of me is saying, where's the African feminism in your talk?
Yeah. Before I let you interview chair, I want to
spread
the genealogy question from both the speakers, and then we can have a round. And so, as when you're speaking, I'm speaking then for you, Chelsey, because the way you spoke about BC, you made the equivalence with people, and so I mean, we immediately hear multiple citations, but also we didn't get the sense. I didn't hear a sense of thinking of Black consciousness not only as a set of intellectual contestations and movements, but also located within a context around which the question of making knowledge was at the center. So it became an equivalent of a single statement around that which became not phenomenological, and Blackness couldn't be phenomenological through reading Michelle Wright. And I wondered what it would mean to actually account for a genealogy of Black consciousness if it is to be referred to, that takes seriously the scenes and sites of its production as an intellectual and political discourse. And then what would those citations look like? Because it seemed that you would jump from reading the text as a form to sociological claims as though there was a seamless equivalence between them without any form of citation. And then Kharnita, when you were speaking, I was wondering if the question of disability studies presents us with a genealogy or a set of genealogies that has something to do with where disability doesn't come up. I was thinking, even as I thought myself, because I say Black woman, I would say queer, but I wouldn't talk about my disability as a sight or scene. And I was thinking through as you spoke. I was like, what is it? And I thought, is it the collect? Is it that we don't? Does it feel like a confession, like a personal confession, right? Or is it about? Is it also? And then I was thinking earlier this morning, or yesterday, when I had a Facebook rant about my books, I was looking for my copy of Zami, and I had to go online. I had to read the PDF, and I ran into this page, into the first page, as I start, and I noticed that Audre Lorde begins by talking about walking to school, about going to school when she was blind. But that's not what we think about when we think of what the forms of identitarian politics that she's doing. We don't think of her blindness. We think of lesbian and poor and migrant, etc., etc. So I wondered what happens to the ways that other forms of difference have been articulated as possessions of the self, that ability or disability hasn't been done in the same intellectual traditions, right? So then disability studies enters in a particular set of genealogies, but not in a way that that other forms of difference have done, upon which they have. I don't know if I even know how to say it, but so we have disability studies emerging as various kinds of conversations premised around, I think, the way you talk about institutional forms of justice, right? And then you expand it with the question of the epistemological, ontological, the ethical. and yet, even I think about university politics, at least it fits, like the Gender Equity Office and Transformation Office mobilize particular kinds of politics, P, capital, small p as well, where the Disability Office frames the narrative around inclusion, right? So then this instigates a different relationship to institutional demands, right? Which make a different kind of set of claims, because it doesn't become a property of myself. It becomes a claim at precisely what the institution can make, how the institution can make my life easier or make more livable. So what are the other ways that genealogies we can think then that disability appears, that ask that the questions that you're asking, because I think that you're asking questions that are not in disability studies, right? And it's not in feminist studies.
Yeah.
It's not in colonial studies.
Yeah, but they're there, because if I'm saying if there are narratives that begin, like she begins by saying, I was walking, when I went to school I was blind, and then that was literally the first line of the novel.
Maya Angelou Louise's speech.
Yeah, but so I don't have an answer because my project is precisely crafting a relationship between the three, between decolonial or postcolonial and their different genealogies of decolonial studies, but crafting a relationship between them so that disability becomes as seamlessly included, included as every other category of identity. It really just isn't present at the moment. I mean, so they're decolonial. There are decolonial disability studies emerging. There isn't a decolonial feminist disability studies. There are feminist disability studies, mostly from the global north, that doesn't take the experience in the global south seriously in any form. Even people who are trying to craft relationships between gender and disability in the global south are not doing it, and I say this not in very sophisticated ways. So people who've read disability studies would not have read anything out of feminist studies. People who've read who've read feminist studies would not have read any disability studies. People who read decolonial studies have not. And one of the greater problems, which Sean Gretsch actually talks about, is the way in which people in disability studies use colonialism as a metaphor. People in decolonial studies use disability as metaphors, and in both and in all those instances erase the actual experience of disability and what disability does discursively, what disability does as a structural a structural material reality in organizing the way in which we're all disciplined. And the task really, and I don't have an answer. I will not, even if I've been doing this for 50 years, will not venture an answer, because I think, to be decolonial is to provide a space where we have epistemic plurality, right? So I'm working towards an answer. I'm going to try and cobble a genealogy of some sort, and my desire is for others to also find those connections and to build them. So I don't know if that's satisfying.
That's very satisfying.
Okay, I'm going to start with, thank you so much for your questions. I want to start with the second one. So the call for papers, right, listed intersectionality as one of the themes. But I had precisely this debate with Linda, right, that Kimberly Crenshaw is not African, right, the fact that she's black. But I thought, still intersectionality, so I actually submitted 2 abstracts. Apart from this one, the other one was on Kobano Matlua's Period Pain and looking at the gender politics in that novel. And then, the organizers picked this one on intersectionality, which I don't want to put the blame on the organizers, but I was also wary of this. And on the other hand, I find that if we're talking about intersectionality, or if it's one of the themes that the conference addresses, it seems okay to deal with the theories, to deal with the work of someone who has actually developed that theory. And I don't want to use Koleka Putuma sociologically or anthropologically, but I did find it interesting or striking that in her Lifeline poem, which is a list of names, she starts with Kimberly Crenshaw, Audre Lorde, and Angela Davis. I guess we can even problematize that, why there's 3 American women there before all the African women are listed. But I really appreciate that, and I had thought about that. That's why there was, there were two different abstracts sent out, and then I did end up with Crenshaw. And the first question is really complicated. I mean, you want me to declare what I think, right, this critique is about. And on the one hand, I want to give scholars like Gross-Fogel the benefit of the doubt, in the sense that it might be that he genuinely believes that bringing in questions of gender within anti-racist struggles actually is counterproductive, and
right? So that there is a genuine, how can I say, belief that this is actually a divide and conquer strategy. But on the other hand, I really see this as an investment in patriarchy. And the reason why I'm saying that is also, why is it, for example, that Grossfogel keeps giving these talks also in Europe now, right, on decolonizing intersectionality, but does not actually address Kimberly Crenshaw's scholarship in writing, right? Because it seems as if, oh, this is actually, we don't need to give these theories enough respect so that we are actually, right, already in the way in which Crenshaw's work is spoken about without actually being addressed, to me suggests that there is something about masculinism at play. And often some of the critiques that are leveraged, if they read the work carefully, actually Crenshaw herself has addressed some of the critiques. So yeah, I don't know if it's exactly answering your question, but help me.
That's not my question. My question,
Okay.
yes, of course it's patriarchal, of course it's anti-feminist, of course it's masculinist. My question is,
Yeah.
why do you think, because, okay, fine, so ignore Crenshaw,
Yeah.
ignore Deloritis, ignore everybody who said intersectional, ignore all of those feminists for many years who were saying nexus of oppressions, overlaid oppressions, all the metaphors, all the language about mixing and overlapping and intersecting and Venn diagrams, all of the many, many metaphors that feminists in different traditions have come up with, trying to understand that it's not just one thing happening, right? So ignore Crenshaw, but and even in the South African context, I mean, people are there's a lot of work on that uses intersectionality, or that kind of resituates intersectionality, right? So it's a word that people are using all the time.
Yeah.
And there's writing on it, and there's social organizing around it, and so on. My question is really about, not do you think it's patriarchal? I think you do, and I agree. But why? What is going on? Why is this work important to do now? Not your work. Why is it important to have a thing called a decolonial critique of intersectionality, right? Given, if we take that intersectionality is a feminist concept, right? Why is it so important for very white? What do you think is going on when very visible masculine? Why do you think it's so important to have this hyper-masculinist, hyper-patriarchal investment that calls itself decolonial, doing this work now? What do you think? So that's my question. So I agree with you. Of course it's patriarchal. Yes, of course it's backlash or masculinist or all of those things. But I don't know. I feel like there's something. I'm not being fair because I don't know the answer to this, and I somehow expect you. I want to hear what your answer is as I work out what my answer is.
Yeah.
So, so that's really the question. The question is, why is, because you and I both know, okay, Grossfogel is doing it, but you've heard this somewhere else. You've heard in other social movements, people who are supposed to be invested in a very radical, global, decolonial, transformative movement and systems of thought, saying men of color have no patriarchal power, saying it's impossible to be but it seems to me that we're seeing a lot of it in the last 6 years or so, right? Longer than that, but really in the last 6 years or so, right? I mean, it seems to me that there was a time when people would say these things, but they would pretend. People would say non-sexism, they would mouth it, and they would go and do their violent, hateful, misogynist work in private. And they would stand on platforms and they would say, it's unacceptable, and they would, the feminists and the queers and the working class, yes, and then they would go to do the violent work. But now we're at a moment where people who supposedly come from that tradition seem emboldened to say feminism is nonsense again, right? Because that's basically what people are saying. All of you feminists, just like, it's nonsense. Nobody cares. We're back there. It's like, just, what do you think? Yeah, that's the question. That's the unfair question.
Wow. I don't know what is happening you know, maybe women of colors. Maybe women of color's voices have become, they feel more threatening to men recently, but I don't know why. I think I would have to think about these scholars' works also separately, right? So Tommy Curry teaches a course called Black Male Studies, and I think one of the reasons why he feels, I guess, emboldened, if you want to use this work, has also to do with the very concrete reality of Black genocide that is going on in the US, and that does affect disproportionately Black men. But then why would you want to silence the fact that it also affects Black women? I don't know. I don't know the answer to your question. It seems to be a very complicated question. But also, when I see someone like Rose Fogel give this kind of talk, I'm thinking, this sounds like so much like the arguments made about, you know, gender being in the way of the Black Power movement in the 60s. Like, it really sounds so old-fashioned and so obsolete and yeah, that you wonder why would a scholar do this, and yet they're doing it. And I'm not exactly sure what is going on in the contemporary moment that is, you know, reverting us back to older times. Maybe some men do feel that they're in a vulnerable position while they're not. And in that way, the arguments seem to almost, you know, not replicate, but also resemble, you know, arguments that are dominant today about white injury or white people as injured, which is a fantasy, right? Because there is nothing, there is no white injury going on. And in the same way, again, I don't want to mix apples and oranges, but maybe the two things are interconnected somehow, to where, you know, people who are powerful actually feel threatened in ways that are not real.
I'm starting to feel
Yeah,
like
help,
you're
help.
getting to something there. You're getting
Thanks.
to something, and perhaps it could also sort of, you know, I don't have a very strong vocabulary for the theories we're talking about today, but perhaps it has to do with maybe recognizing a kind of a positionality as a European scholar, where you're coming from Europe, the North, right? And the current moment there politically, the radical sort of political insecurity about about outsiders of any form or kind, right? Encroaching the kind of territorial struggles that the question of migrancy brings up. Maybe in some way or form could be tied to this, like, and it's a very masculine struggle, that in and of itself. So perhaps that in some way there might be a way to pull from that to get to what Pumla is trying to point at as a moment, as a key moment, as a kind of a turning point, a tipping point in a sense, in the conversation around intersectionality and African feminism. It's close. I think you almost. Yeah.
Because the fact that white people in this country collectively continue to own 85% of the land and 91% of the companies does not prevent them from even talking about white genocide or reverse racism and this kind of stuff. And Pumla made me think, I don't know, but I wonder if there's a relationship there between discourses of white victimization or white injury and some of the masculinist discourses about men as injured or silenced, or I'm not sure.
That's panel. Really enjoyed this discussion. And hopefully you stayed as we continued. The rest walked away. And I'm sure we can continue over tea with the discussion.
Thank you.